I am Patrick Rothfuss, author of Name of the Wind, my first book. Describing the book is very difficult for me. I used to try to practice the pitch when I was trying to sell the book, and I discovered very quickly that I'm very bad at it. I'm good at making a joke pitch, if you wanted to hear that. I could say it's like, the Hollywood pitch, where you compare it to two movies that are vastly successful. It's like The Princess Bride meets The Crow. It's a ridiculous comparison. But in terms of a quick synopsis, it's the story of a man's life. It's kind of a backstage pass to the myth of the hero. You get to meet this person, and then you find out the mythology that surrounds him, and then you find out where that mythology really came from. You see, that sounds horrifying. That sounds like the most boring early-level college class that you were ever forced to take to graduate. It's not that boring. The trilogy took me a long time to write, just because I did something that no reasonable person would ever do, which is normally you write a book and then you sell a book. But I've always thought of this as the book. And so I started writing, and then eventually it hit about 400,000 words, and I wasn't at the end yet. And I realized this couldn't be just a book. So I actually wrote it all the way to the end of the story. And that's how I think of it now, as the story. That took me 7 years to get to the end of the story. And then it's been another 7 years to today. So before I ever sold it, before it was ever printed, it took me about 14 years, including the endless revisions, which is probably why people like it as much as they do. It's sort of like a river stone at this point. It's been, smoothed till it's like glass. So, how did I come to write this book? I've always read fantasy. My first chapter books were C.S. Lewis's Narnia Chronicles. That's what I grew up reading. And so after that, I read everything. I read about a book a day for most of my childhood, 2 if they were short or if it was cold out. Lived out in the country, didn't have a lot of kids to play with. And I remember a neighbor moved in up the hill at one point in my grandfather's old house. And he came down, and he, of course, was going crazy. He didn't have anyone to do anything with. And he'd always come down to my house, and he'd be, do you want to do something? And I was really irritated. I was doing something. I was reading. So, unfortunately, if you read a fantasy novel a day for about 8 years, you realize pretty quickly that a lot of it is really the same. And when I was 14, you had an elf, had a dragon, magic sword. Yeah, hey, I'm happy. That's great. But eventually I would get to the point where I'd pick up the book and I'd be like, hey, new fantasy book. And have I read this before? Well, I kind of had. It was very samey. And so I wanted to do something a little bit different. I realized you didn't need a dragon, you didn't need an elf, you didn't need a evil sorcerer trying to destroy the world. You could do something different. It's very flattering that people say that I've revitalized it. And there's been some reviews that have said that. The Times review, of course, was terribly flattering. A lot of times people write me email and they say, I quit reading fantasy 10 years ago because I was bored reading the same story again and again. I certainly didn't set off to revitalize the fantasy genre. That wasn't on my list of goals. I wanted to write a story that I wanted to read. And I wish I could take credit for that thought, but I actually heard that when I caught Peter S. Beagle talking on a panel. And he said, I think we all write the stories that we wish we could read. And that's what I wanted to read, is a really good story about a person, very character-centered, but not so character-centered that it just ended up being pretentious and pointless, like some of this literary fiction where the entire book is somebody drinking tea and staring out the window into the rain and thinking about their mom. No. You want interesting things, you want mythic things, but without the character, why am I even here? Why would I care if not for a good character? I have had a very broad education. That's a very generous way of describing my educational career. I spent 9 years getting my undergraduate degree. The joke is, of course, a lot of people go to school for 9 years. They're usually called doctors. I went for 9 years and just graduated with the regular bachelor's degree. I love learning things. I would take a class on anthropology and find out that anthropology was really interesting, and Eastern religion and Greek mythology and Sanskrit and Eastern theater and what isn't interesting. I think because I studied so much of that, it enabled me to build a world that was very diverse. I mean, if you grow up and all you read is Tolkien and Shakespeare, you're not going to be able to draw on an awful lot. I get to draw on 15 years of reading fantasy novels of all sorts and all sorts of literature, because I've read all sorts of literature. I get to draw on 100 different cultures that I've studied, 300-level philosophy courses. I was almost a clinical psychologist. I was almost a chemical engineer. I went to school for chemical engineering at first. I think it's allowed me to come at writing fantasy from a slightly different direction. There's been a fair amount of speculation as to how much of me there is in Kvothe. I think generally it's a complicated question because it's easy to see that I have some of the same opinions or he has some of the same opinions. I think the main characteristic that we share is curiosity. He is very curious about all of these things. I'm very curious. You can't sit me down in front of someone or something, and I want to figure out about it. I want to find out how it works. I want to hear interesting stories about it. In that way, we're very similar. What a lot of people don't realize is that I've been effectively roommates with Kvothe for 14 years now. Imagine method acting apart for 14 years because I'm constantly behind his eyes and I'm talking like him. I'm writing as if I were him and I'm thinking as if I were him. So it's not just me leaking into his character. After all this time, I've been wearing his skin for so long, I think it's fair to assume that I've soaked up some of his personality traits, which is more than slightly creepy if you think about it, especially considering the sort of person that he is.